It was a chilly morning in the heart of the city. The sun was still hidden behind a veil of clouds, and the streets were starting to come alive, but not everyone was ready to face the world. Among the bustling crowd, a young woman huddled in a corner of a busy café, her clothes ragged and her face drawn with the weight of a life lived on the fringes. Her name was Emily. Just 21 years old, she had lived on the streets for the past 2 years, ever since she'd run away from an abusive home. The city had swallowed her whole, but she had learned to survive in the cracks of society. She knew where to find the free meals, the places to sleep, and how to keep a low profile, avoiding the police and the other dangers that lurked in the shadows. But that morning was different. Emily wasn't thinking about how to survive. She was thinking about what she could do to help someone else, a woman who seemed to be in trouble. The woman, whose name was Grace, had walked into the cafe like she owned the place, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. She looked out of place, like someone who had never known what it meant to struggle. Dressed in an expensive coat and carrying a designer purse, Grace looked like she had everything anyone could ever want. But her face was pale, and her eyes were wild with fear. She paced nervously, her fingers twisting around the strap of her bag. It wasn't long before she caught sight of Emily sitting by the window. For a moment, their eyes met. Grace looked away quickly, embarrassed, and continued pacing. Emily, sensing something was wrong, watched her carefully. She had seen that look before, the kind of fear that comes from being caught between two worlds, unsure of which one is about to collapse first. Emily stood up, brushing the crumbs from her jacket. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten in a few days, but there was no time for that. She needed to act. Grace was on the phone now, her voice shaky, trying to explain something, but the conversation wasn't going well. Emily knew what that sounded like, desperation. Something was off. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to help. She had nothing to offer in terms of wealth or power, but there was one thing she had, a heart that understood what it was like to have nothing. Before she even realized it, Emily found herself approaching Grace, who was still on the phone. "Excuse me," she said gently, catching Grace's attention. Grace looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. "I don't mean to intrude, but it looks like you're having a rough time. Maybe I could help?" Grace blinked, looking at Emily like she was some kind of mirage. The last thing she expected was a homeless girl offering help. But Emily's voice was kind, and there was a sincerity in her eyes that made Grace pause. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but she was desperate, so she decided to take the chance. "Can I sit?" Emily asked, already moving to the chair across from Grace. Grace hesitated, then nodded, still looking a bit confused. "It's just, I've been through a lot of tough times, and sometimes it helps to have someone listen, you know?" Grace closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, and then put her phone down. "I'm sorry," she said, voice tight. "It's just, I don't know what to do. I'm in a situation that's completely out of my control. And I feel like if I don't do something soon, everything will fall apart." Emily tilted her head, sensing the weight behind Grace's words. "Maybe I can help," she said again, though she wasn't sure how. "I know what it's like to feel lost. Maybe just talking about it will give you some clarity." Grace stared at her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust this stranger. Finally, she let out a long breath. I'm the heiress to a massive fortune," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I never wanted any of it. But my family, they don't want me to be a part of it. And now, I'm being threatened. Someone is after me. And I don't know how to get away." Emily's heart sank. She had no idea how she could help someone so deeply entangled in a world of wealth and power. What could a girl who slept on park benches possibly do for someone like Grace? But there was something in Grace's eyes, a quiet desperation, that made Emily feel like maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference. Before she could speak, Grace's phone rang again. She looked at the screen, her face turning pale. "I have to go," she said abruptly, standing up. "I don't have time to explain. I'll be in touch." She dropped a few bills on the table and rushed out of the cafe, leaving Emily sitting there, stunned. Emily watched her go, her mind racing. What was all that about? A fortune heir? Threats? It was more than she could process in the moment, but one thing was clear: Grace was in trouble, and Emily could feel it in her bones. There had to be more to this story than what Grace had let on. As Emily stood up to leave, her thoughts were consumed by Grace's words. "Someone is after me." That sentence echoed in her mind like a warning, but from who? And why? Little did Emily know, her chance encounter with Grace would pull her into a web of danger, secrets, and lies that would change both of their lives forever. The rich woman she had helped might be the key to something far bigger than Emily could ever imagine. But just as she was about to make a decision that could alter the course of their lives, a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway of the cafe, watching her with cold eyes. The figure stepped forward, locking eyes with Emily. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the man said in a low, menacing tone. Emily's heart raced. What had she gotten herself into? And who was this man? The air around her seemed to thicken, the weight of something unknown pressing down. And in that moment, Emily realized that the story she had just stepped into was far from over. Emily felt the man's eyes on her like a heavy weight, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively took a step back, trying to make sense of the situation. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a dark suit, a stark contrast to the shabby cafe and the chaotic city streets outside. There was something in his posture that suggested he didn't belong here. Not in this part of town. Not anywhere near someone like Emily. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice shaky despite herself. She didn't want to seem scared, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her with cold, calculating eyes, as if weighing her worth. "You're the girl who spoke to Grace, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, with a hint of something dangerous beneath the surface. Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, I just tried to help her." She seemed upset. The man's lips twisted into a slight smirk. "You're quite brave, aren't you? A girl with nothing trying to help someone who has everything." He stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the floor as he closed the distance between them. "But this isn't your fight, sweetheart. You don't want to get involved with people like us." His words sent a chill down Emily's spine. People like us. What did that mean? She had no idea who this man was or what kind of trouble Grace had dragged her into, but it was clear that Grace was deeper into something dangerous than she had let on. "I don't know what you mean," Emily said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. She glanced around, hoping to catch the attention of someone who might help, but the cafe was nearly empty. The few patrons there were oblivious to the growing tension between them. It felt like the walls were closing in. The man didn't seem to care that they were in a public place. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Grace is in trouble, but not in the way you think. She doesn't just have money. She's a liability. And now, you're a part of it. People like her, they don't get to make their own choices. They're owned. Controlled." He paused for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more. "You really think you can help her? You're just a kid off the streets. Do you even know what you're dealing with?" The words stung, but Emily refused to back down. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her, not when she knew something wasn't right. She remembered Grace's face, frantic and desperate. She couldn't just walk away. Not after everything she had just heard. "I don't care who you are or what kind of world you come from," Emily said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I saw someone who needed help. I'm not going to turn my back on her just because you say so." The man's smirk faltered for a moment, but then he straightened up, taking a step back. "Fine. You'll regret this, though," he said, his voice icy. "People like you always do." He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Emily standing there, her hands trembling. The air around her felt thick, as if the conversation had somehow altered the atmosphere. Regret? What did he mean by that? She had no idea, but a feeling of unease settled deep in her gut. She grabbed her bag and hurried out of the cafe, trying to push away the knot forming in her stomach. She had to find Grace, she needed answers. What was going on? Why was she being threatened, and why was it so dangerous for someone like Emily to get involved? The cold wind hit her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The city's noise surrounded her, but it felt distant now, almost muffled. She walked fast, scanning the streets for Grace, but the woman was nowhere in sight. Emily's thoughts were racing. She had to find her. She had to understand what was going on. As she walked past an alleyway, a sudden movement caught her eye. She stopped, straining to see. In the shadows, a figure was crouched down, rifling through a pile of old newspapers and garbage bags. It was a man, but he wasn't the type to be rummaging through trash for food. There was something calculating about the way he moved. He glanced up, locking eyes with Emily, and for a moment, she froze. She had seen him before. Was he following me? The thought hit her like a bolt of lightning. Her pulse quickened as the man stood up, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything, but the tension in the air was palpable. Something about him screamed danger. And he wasn't just a bystander in this mess, he was part of it. Without thinking, Emily turned and quickened her pace, but the man's footsteps echoed behind her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw that he was following her, his strides long and purposeful. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew exactly where she was going. And that he didn't want her to get there. Emily turned a corner, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to get to Grace. She didn't know if the woman was still in danger, but the way the man had spoken, like Grace was a ticking time bomb, was enough to send a wave of dread crashing over her. But when she reached the next intersection, something unexpected happened. A black car pulled up to the curb in front of her, its tinted windows reflecting the dim city light. The door opened slowly, and Emily hesitated, uncertain whether she should approach. The driver's side window lowered, revealing a familiar face. It was Grace. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but when she saw Emily, her expression shifted. "Get in," Grace said urgently, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, you have to come with me. You're in danger now, too." Emily's chest tightened. Danger? She didn't have to be told twice. She hurried toward the car, glancing over her shoulder once more to make sure the man wasn't in sight. But as she slipped into the car and the door slammed shut behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off into the night, leaving the city behind. But the questions only grew louder in Emily's mind. What had Grace gotten herself into? And what had she just walked into? The car sped through the dimly lit streets, the city's skyline shrinking behind them. Emily glanced over at Grace, who was sitting beside her, her fingers clutching the edge of the seat like she was holding onto her last shred of control. Emily could feel the tension radiating off her, an unease that matched her own. She had so many questions, and the silence between them felt suffocating. She wanted answers. But Grace didn't speak. Not at first. The car turned onto a quieter road, the headlights illuminating empty houses and overgrown yards. It wasn't the kind of area Emily was used to. It felt too secluded, too far removed from the world she knew. Her pulse quickened as she instinctively checked the rearview mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The man from the cafe had been too focused, too determined. He wasn't just a random threat, he was connected to something bigger. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come with me," she said, her voice low and shaky. "This isn't your fight. You're in more danger now because of me." Emily felt a surge of frustration. "I don't care about the danger. I care about you." "What's going on, Grace? You're talking about people coming after you like they're not even human. What does it mean, you're owned?" Grace closed her eyes, her face tight with emotion. She didn't respond for a long moment, as if she were struggling with the words. When she finally spoke, it wasn't the answer Emily was expecting. "I wasn't supposed to know," Grace said quietly. "I wasn't supposed to remember. But I do. I have to." Her eyes met Emily's with a sudden intensity. "My family, they're not who you think they are. They're not just wealthy. They run a corporation, no, an empire, built on things I can't even talk about without endangering us both." Emily frowned, trying to follow her. "What kind of empire?" Grace hesitated again, the tension in her voice thickening. "The kind that hides things. Dark things. People think we're a tech company, that we make investments and run businesses. But it's all a cover. I wasn't supposed to know the truth. And now, I'm the last one left to inherit everything. But I don't want it. I don't want any of it." She looked out the window, her gaze lost in the darkness. "But they won't let me go. They'll kill me before they let me walk away from what I'm supposed to be." The weight of her words hung in the air. Emily's mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing. An empire built on dark things. She thought about the man in the cafe, the way he'd spoken to her. His words came back to her now, people like us, and they chilled her. It was starting to make sense, in a way. Grace wasn't just running from her family's wealth, she was running from something far more sinister. "I don't understand," Emily said, her voice tight. "Why you? Why are you the one they're after?" Grace's eyes flickered with pain, and she turned away, gazing out the window as if she could shut everything out. "Because I'm the last of the bloodline. And because I know things. Things that I shouldn't know. That I was never meant to remember. My family, they've done things. Horrible things. And now, I can't unsee it." Before Emily could ask more, the car swerved sharply to the side, and Grace's hand shot out to grab her arm. "We're here," she said breathlessly, her face pale. "We can't stay on the road much longer. It's not safe." Emily blinked, trying to focus as the car came to a halt in front of a large, imposing mansion. It looked like something out of a movie, gothic, almost eerie, with wrought iron gates and dark windows that seemed to watch them. It was as if the house itself was alive, hiding secrets in every corner. The door opened abruptly, and a man stepped out from the shadows of the mansion, his silhouette tall and imposing. He was dressed in a black suit, much like the man from the cafe. Emily's stomach tightened as she realized that this was no coincidence. This was the kind of place where power and secrets lived in the same breath. "Get inside," Grace said urgently, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the mansion. "He's one of them. He'll help us, but you have to trust me." Emily's heart raced, but there was no turning back now. She had already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Whatever this was, whatever dark empire Grace was running from, it had swallowed her whole, and now she was right in the middle of it. The man at the door watched them with cold eyes but didn't say anything as they entered. The inside of the mansion was even more unsettling than the outside. The walls were adorned with strange portraits, the air heavy with dust and the scent of old wood. It felt like a place where time had stopped, where history had been buried under layers of money and influence. Grace led Emily down a narrow hallway, stopping in front of a large door. She paused, her fingers hovering over the handle, and then turned to Emily with a look of pure desperation. "Please, you need to understand," she whispered. "They'll do anything to get me back. They'll stop at nothing. They think I've lost my memory, but I haven't. I've been running for years, but I can't run anymore. I have to face them. And now you're here. You're part of this." The words hit Emily like a tidal wave. "What do you mean, I'm part of this?" Grace's eyes filled with sorrow. "You don't understand. You've seen them now. You've spoken to them. They don't forget people like you." Before Emily could ask anything else, the door swung open, revealing a darkened room with a large desk in the center. A man was seated behind it, his face obscured by shadows. But the feeling that came from him was unmistakable, powerful, cold, dangerous. Grace stepped forward, her voice trembling. "This is the man who's been pulling the strings. The one who controls everything." She turned to Emily, her eyes full of fear and resolve. "We have to trust him, or we won't survive." The man at the desk leaned forward, his hands steepled in front of him. "Welcome, Emily," he said softly, his voice smooth but edged with something darker. "I've been waiting for you." The air in the room felt thick, as if it had been held captive by the dark wood and cold stone walls for years. Emily's heartbeat drummed in her ears, loud and insistent, as she stared at the man behind the desk. His presence was overwhelming, like a storm gathering on the horizon, impossible to ignore. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet were frozen in place, unwilling to betray the fear she couldn't hide. Grace moved closer, her breath shallow, but she didn't speak again. Instead, her eyes flickered between the man at the desk and Emily, and then she dropped her gaze, as if ashamed of something she couldn't explain. The man, whose face was still hidden in shadow, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished surface. The sound echoed in the silence, unnervingly calm. "Grace," the man said, his voice smooth, yet laced with something cold, something that made Emily's stomach tighten. "I didn't expect you to bring someone else into this. Especially not someone like her." He nodded at Emily, his eyes hidden in the darkness, but she could feel them on her, like a weight pressing down. Grace flinched, the guilt clear in her posture. "She's not just someone, Michael. She's trying to help. I didn't have a choice." Michael's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Help? Is that what you think, Grace? You think you're helping her by dragging her into this? You don't understand the game you're playing." His gaze finally met Emily's, and a chill ran down her spine. "You think you know what's going on, but you have no idea how deep it goes." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What game? What was he talking about? She had no answers, only questions, questions that seemed to multiply with every second that passed. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd already made a mistake by getting involved. But there was no going back now. She couldn't leave Grace to face whatever this was alone. "Who are you?" Emily asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. She didn't care about the tension, the looming threat. She needed to know what was happening. Michael's smile widened, but it wasn't kind. "Who am I?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm the person who's been watching your every move, Emily. I'm the one who knows exactly what you're capable of, more than you even realize." The blood drained from Emily's face. "Watching me?" She could barely believe it. "What do you mean? Why?" "Because Michael said, his eyes never leaving hers, "you're a part of something bigger. You always have been. You're not just some street kid, Emily. You've been chosen. This has been planned since the moment you met Grace." Emily's chest tightened. "What are you talking about? What does Grace have to do with this?" Grace's eyes darted between Michael and Emily, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Emily, you have to listen. This is my family's legacy. They never told me the truth, but I remember now. And it's not just about money or power. It's about control. And now, they're coming for us both." "Us both?" Emily repeated, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that didn't make sense. "What do you mean? What do they want?" Michael laughed, a short, bitter sound that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "What they want, Grace, is for you to fall in line. You've been running from them, but you'll never outrun them. They will never let you go, no matter how far you run, no matter what you remember." He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping sharply against the floor. The movement was so quick, it made Emily flinch. The room seemed to close in on her as Michael approached, the tension thickening with every step he took. "And as for you, Emily," he said, stopping just a few feet away. "You've played your part in all of this, whether you realize it or not. I don't need to threaten you. You've already made your choice." Grace stepped forward, her voice desperate now. "Michael, stop. Please." She looked at Emily with something akin to apology, but her eyes were filled with raw fear. "They're watching us. They've been watching for days, maybe weeks. And if we don't do what they want, you don't know what you're asking," Michael interrupted sharply, his voice rising, his anger becoming more palpable. "You can't just waltz into this and think you have control. There are forces at work here that you'll never understand. You won't survive." Emily's mind was spinning. Forces? What kind of power were they talking about? Was she really part of whatever this twisted legacy was? She felt like she was drowning in a pool of unknowns, the weight of Michael's words dragging her under. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape before whatever this was enveloped her, but she couldn't leave Grace. Not now. Grace stepped back, her face hardening with a sudden, frightening resolve. "I'll face them. I'll do what they want, if it means keeping Emily safe." Michael laughed again, the sound colder this time. "Safe? You think you can keep her safe from this? You think they'll spare either of you?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and she took a small step forward. "What's going to happen?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What's going on here? You keep saying it's too dangerous for us, but what exactly are we up against?" Michael's eyes gleamed with something dark, something that made Emily's blood run cold. "You want to know?" he said, stepping closer until their faces were inches apart. "You're up against people who control everything. Who control the city. The markets. Even people like you, Grace. And now, they control her too." He turned to Grace, his gaze full of contempt. "She doesn't know yet, but she will. She has no choice." Grace's face twisted in pain, and Emily could see the weight of the truth crashing down on her. There was something worse than death in her eyes, something worse than the fear of losing her life. It was the fear of losing herself. Michael stepped back, his lips curling into a smile that sent an ice-cold shiver down Emily's spine. "It's too late to go back now," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "The game has already begun." Just then, the door behind them slammed open, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Emily's pulse spiked. Who else was coming? Michael's eyes flickered toward the door, and he straightened up, his demeanor shifting instantly. "You're too late," he said, his voice suddenly hard and clipped. "They're already here." In the tense silence that followed, Emily knew that everything was about to spiral out of control. There was no escape. No more running. Whatever this twisted game was, it was unfolding around her, and she was caught in the middle of it. And in that moment, she realized something. The truth wasn't something they were going to let her walk away from. The door swung open with a force that rattled the frame, and Emily's breath hitched as a new figure stepped into the room. At first, she couldn't make out the face, just the silhouette of someone tall and powerful, dressed in a dark, tailored suit. The man's presence was immediate, overwhelming. But what made her blood run cold was the look on Grace's face. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. Recognition. The man stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating, and a strange sense of déjà vu washed over Emily. She couldn't place it at first, but something about him was unnervingly familiar. He stopped beside Michael, his gaze sweeping over the room, finally resting on Emily. "You've done well, Michael," the man said, his voice low but commanding, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. "I didn't expect this to be so easy." He turned to Grace, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I think we both know why I'm here." Grace's face paled even more, and for a split second, Emily saw the woman she thought she knew slip away. She was no longer the determined, brave woman who had fought to help her. Now, she was something smaller, weaker, cornered. "Ethan," Grace said, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" "You know I'm not going back." "I won't go back to them." "I won't." Ethan stepped closer, his hand raised, silencing her with a single gesture. "Grace, you don't get to make that choice anymore," he said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. "You never did. You were always meant to be a part of this. You were a part of this." For a long moment, Emily was paralyzed. The room felt suffocating, every breath harder to take than the last. Ethan's words hit her like a punch to the gut. Grace wasn't just a victim in this mess, she was a pawn, a piece of a much larger game. And now, Emily was caught up in it too. "You're not here by accident, Emily," Ethan said suddenly, turning his attention to her. "You think you're helping Grace, but you're playing right into their hands. You've been a part of this long before you even knew it." Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, the panic rising in her chest. She needed answers, needed something to make sense of the madness, but all she got was confusion and fear. Ethan smiled again, a slow, dangerous curl of his lips. "You think Grace is the heir? The one they want? No. The truth is far worse, my dear. You're the heir. You're the one they've been waiting for." The words hit Emily like a thunderclap. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. She couldn't even move. She felt the room tilt, the walls closing in around her. He was talking about her? He had to be wrong. She was just a girl from the streets. She had nothing. Grace's eyes locked with Emily's, and there was something in her gaze, something apologetic. "I didn't know, Emily. I swear I didn't know. I thought I was the one. But they were always watching you. You were always their choice." Emily shook her head, trying to make sense of the revelation. No, you're wrong." She turned to Michael, who was standing silently beside Ethan, his face a mask of indifference. "What is he talking about? What does this mean?" "I don't," but before she could finish, Ethan's voice cut through the tension again. "It means everything is about to change. It means the real game is just beginning." A horrible realization began to dawn on Emily. They had been planning this all along, from the moment she'd met Grace, maybe even before she had been part of something much bigger than herself. A legacy, a bloodline that she had never known, one that had been hidden, manipulated, and shaped by people who controlled everything. And now, Ethan continued, his gaze piercing, now we just need to see if you're worthy of your inheritance. His words stung, and Emily could barely keep her voice steady. What do you mean, worthy? I don't want anything from you. I don't want any of this. But Ethan was already stepping closer, his eyes narrowing as if he were studying a puzzle that had finally clicked into place. You've always had a choice, Emily. But you never knew what you were choosing. You think running away from your past makes you free? No. You're part of this world. You always have been. It's time to accept who you really are. The tension in the room seemed to crackle with energy, an electric pulse that made Emily feel like she was about to explode from the pressure. Her head was spinning, and she struggled to make sense of the words coming at her. She wanted to fight back, to scream, to tell them all they were wrong, but something about Ethan's certainty held her in place. Grace reached out, her voice trembling. Emily, please. I didn't want this for you. I didn't want to drag you into my world. But now that you're here, you need to understand, you have to be strong. They won't let you go. And they'll do anything to get what they want from you. For a moment, Emily felt like she was suffocating. The walls of the room seemed to close in even tighter, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. She was part of this. She was the heir. But what did that even mean? What was she inheriting? What kind of power had they been hiding from her? The sound of footsteps approaching from behind her snapped her out of her daze. Emily turned, her heart racing as a new figure entered the room. This time, it was a woman. Tall, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. Her gaze met Emily's for just a moment, and then she turned to Ethan. Is it done? The woman asked, her voice sharp, almost mechanical. Ethan's expression hardened. It's almost done. But there's still one last piece to the puzzle. His eyes locked onto Emily's again, a predatory glint in his gaze. And that piece is you. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Emily realized she was no longer just a witness. She wasn't just the girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was part of something much, much bigger than she could have ever imagined. And whatever was coming next, she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But there was no way out now. The stakes had never been higher, and the game was far from over. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point, the heavy air thick with the weight of secrets and betrayal. Emily could feel her heart hammering in her chest, each beat like a countdown. She was trapped in a web she couldn't escape. She had been part of this world without even knowing it, tied to a legacy that was now closing in on her. Ethan stood before her, his eyes filled with cold calculation. The woman beside him, silent, poised, watched her with a detached expression, as if the whole situation was a mere formality. Everything had been building up to this moment, this final confrontation where Emily would either accept her inheritance or be crushed under the weight of the forces aligned against her. She had never wanted any of this, but it was too late to back out now. You think you're the victim in all of this, Emily, Ethan said, his voice calm, almost pitying. But you're not. You're part of the plan. Always have been. All your life, you've been groomed for this moment. Grace stepped forward, her voice trembling with desperation. No, Emily. You have to trust me. They've been watching you your whole life. They've always known about you. She reached for Emily's hand, but Emily pulled away, a sudden chill settling in her chest. You have no idea how much power these people have. You can't just walk away from it. Emily's mind raced as the weight of the truth pressed down on her. She'd been watched, groomed, she wasn't some innocent bystander, she was a piece of the puzzle, the heir to something far bigger than she ever imagined. The words rattled in her mind like a storm. But what did that mean? Before she could process any further, The woman beside Ethan stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Emily's. "The time for denial is over," she said, her voice smooth and unfeeling. "You'll come with us now. You'll do what's required, or you'll see just how far we're willing to go to make you understand your place." Emily's thoughts scrambled. She could hear the coldness in the woman's voice, the finality in her words. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for any escape. What was she supposed to do now? There was no way out, no way to turn back. She felt as if the walls were closing in, trapping her in this unthinkable fate. But then, in that moment of pure terror, a sudden realization hit her. It was a truth she hadn't wanted to face, a final piece of the puzzle that clicked into place. She wasn't just part of this world, she was more than that. She was the power they had been fighting for all along. It wasn't just about money or control, it was about something deeper. Something that she had unknowingly inherited, something within her bloodline that had made her the key to everything. The room seemed to spin around her as her thoughts collided in a rush of clarity. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't just the victim. She was the force they had all been trying to manipulate. "Wait," Emily said, her voice gaining strength, surprising even herself. "You think you can control me? You think you can just make me join you?" "No." Grace's eyes widened, her face pale with fear. "Emily, don't," but Emily was no longer listening. She stepped forward, ignoring the worried glances from both Grace and Ethan. The weight of the truth was starting to set in. She had power, real power, and it was time she took control of it. The coldness she had felt before, the sense of being pushed around, of being led by invisible strings, was melting away. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about fighting back. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he took a step toward her, his voice steady. "You think you can stop this? You have no idea what you're dealing with. You can't run from your inheritance. You were born to take this place. You'll never outrun your bloodline." But Emily was shaking her head now, her voice steady, even stronger. "I don't care about bloodlines. I don't care about any of this. What you've been trying to control, manipulate, it's mine now. It always was. You don't have the power you think you do." The room seemed to hold its breath, as if time itself were frozen. The truth hung in the air, dense and heavy. Michael, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "She's right," he said. "You think you control her, Ethan? You never did. She's always been the one pulling the strings. It's been her all along. That's why we were watching her." There was a beat of stunned silence as everyone processed what Michael had just revealed. Emily felt a cold shock shoot through her veins, but there was something else, relief. For the first time, it felt like she was standing on solid ground. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. He turned to Michael, then to the woman who had been silently observing. "What is this? What do you mean she's been the one pulling the strings?" Michael stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Emily. "You've always had control, Emily. You're not just the heir. You're the catalyst. The one who's been quietly guiding everything from the shadows. You thought you were powerless. You thought you were just a kid from the streets. But that's the lie they've been feeding you. You've always known what was happening. You've always known how to make things work out your way." Ethan's face twisted with rage, the realization settling in like a heavy weight. "No," he hissed. This can't be possible." But Emily, now feeling the weight of her own power, finally understood. She had always known. It had been in her all along, the ability to shape the world around her, to make people see things her way, to manipulate events as if they were pieces on a chessboard. The city, the family, the legacy, they were all part of a game, and Emily had been a player the entire time, even if she hadn't known it. The woman who had been silent for so long finally spoke, her voice sharp and cold. "You can't change the past, Emily. But you can change the future. It's in your hands now. You're the one who decides whether this empire falls or rises." Emily's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something else in her gaze, fear. They were all afraid of her. And in that moment, something inside Emily snapped. She wasn't going to let them control her anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone decide her fate. She had everything she needed. The power was hers. With a final, defiant breath, Emily turned away from them all. "The empire ends now," she said. "On my terms." But just as she was about to walk out, Ethan's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Remember this, Emily," he said, his voice low and full of venom. "This may be your game now, but you'll never escape the consequences of your bloodline. Never." Emily didn't turn back. She didn't need to. She knew what was coming, and she was ready. She walked out of the room, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was free. Emily's steps echoed through the hallway as she made her way down the grand corridor. Each stride felt lighter than the last, the weight of the legacy she had just claimed finally settling into her bones. She had always felt like an outsider, like she didn't belong to the world she found herself in. But now, for the first time, she understood that it wasn't about belonging, it was about choosing where she stood. The silence of the mansion was broken only by her footsteps, but in the back of her mind, she could still hear Ethan's words, like an ominous reminder of everything that had come before. "You'll never escape the consequences of your bloodline," the thought lingered, like a shadow trailing her, but Emily didn't flinch. She had walked away from them. She had made her choice. As she passed by the tall windows, the city sprawled beneath her like a living thing, alive with possibilities, alive with danger. She had control now, but that didn't mean it would be easy. She could already feel the weight of the world pressing against her shoulders, the responsibility of a power she never wanted but had been born into. Grace appeared at the end of the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with concern. Emily slowed her pace, her heart aching as she met her friend's gaze. Grace had been a part of this, a crucial piece of the puzzle, but now she was free. Emily had made sure of that. Grace didn't belong in the world they had been trapped in, neither of them did. "I don't know what to say," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Emily shook her head. "None of this was your fault. You didn't know." She paused, her thoughts spinning. "But now we both know. We both know the truth. We've both been used. But we're not their puppets anymore." Grace smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "You really mean that, don't you? You're going to be okay?" Emily took a deep breath, looking out over the city once more. "I don't know. But I'll try. I've got to take control of my life now, for both of us. And that means tearing this whole system down. One piece at a time." Grace stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for Emily's. "I'll help you," she said softly. "I'll help you however I can." Emily nodded, squeezing Grace's hand gently. It wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't alone anymore. They would figure this out together, piece by piece. It was a new beginning, one born out of a tangled mess of lies, power, and manipulation. But the future was now theirs to shape. The days that followed were filled with changes. Emily dove headfirst into the world she had only just begun to understand. The power of her bloodline, the empire that stretched across the city and beyond, was vast. But it was also fragile. She had learned enough to know that. The people who controlled it, who pulled the strings, had always underestimated the most important factor: choice. Emily was no longer a pawn. She was the queen, and she intended to play the game her way. She set to work building her own network of allies, people who had been overlooked, ignored, or oppressed by the very system that had once held her captive. She knew the system from the inside out, and that gave her an edge. Her strength didn't lie in wealth or influence, it lay in the knowledge of what had been done to her, and how she could turn it around. At the same time, the shadow of Ethan's warning still lingered in her mind. The consequences of her bloodline weren't something she could easily escape. The more she uncovered about the Empire's inner workings, the more she realized that there were factions within it, each one trying to claim control, each one willing to do whatever it took to ensure their dominance. And yet, as she took each step forward, Emily found herself questioning what it all meant. What did she really want from all this power? Was it about revenge, or was it about creating something new? Every decision she made now had the weight of the future pressing down on it. And with that came the knowledge that there would be sacrifices. Weeks passed, and the world she had once thought of as an insurmountable maze began to make sense. She found herself working more closely with the people who had once been her enemies, forging alliances with those who had a stake in changing the system. There were meetings held in back rooms, secret deals made in the dead of night, but Emily was no longer afraid. She was in control now, and she would do what it took to change everything. But it wasn't all business. Grace was always there, her friend, her support. Together, they found moments of peace amidst the chaos. They spent evenings sitting in quiet corners, talking about the lives they had once dreamed of before all of this started. And for a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't tangled in power struggles and bloodlines, a future where she and Grace could simply live. But Emily knew that kind of life would never be possible, not with what she had inherited, not with the enemies she had made. The game was far from over. It was a month before Emily saw Ethan again. It happened on a night that was colder than most, the kind of night that felt like a warning. She was sitting in her office, reviewing documents, when the door opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his dark eyes studying her with the same cold intensity as before. "You think you've won, don't you?" Ethan's voice was calm, but there was something in it, a tension, an edge, that made Emily's pulse quicken. "I'm still here, aren't I?" Emily replied, her voice steady. She didn't rise from her chair, didn't make a move toward him. This time, it was her turn to hold the power. "You're playing a dangerous game, Emily," Ethan warned. "You may have taken control for now, but it won't last. You're in over your head." Emily looked him straight in the eye, her heart steady. "I don't need anyone telling me what I can and can't do. Not anymore." There was a long silence, and for the first time, Ethan seemed uncertain. He didn't say anything for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then, finally, he spoke. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's time I step out of the way. But remember this, Emily, you'll never be able to outrun your past. It's always going to follow you." Emily didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to outrun it," she said quietly. "I'm ready to face it. All of it." Ethan's lips curled into a slight, almost respectful smile. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving her to face the future on her own. As the door clicked shut behind him, Emily sat back in her chair, looking out at the city below. The weight of everything still pressed on her, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She was breathing. And that was enough. The game was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, Emily found herself grappling with the reality of the life she had stepped into. The Empire, with its vast network of influence, didn't just crumble because she chose to break free. It had its own momentum, its own life force, and the consequences of trying to disrupt it were far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. She spent sleepless nights in her office, poring over documents, studying the threads of power that connected the wealthy families, the corporations, the politicians, everyone who had a stake in maintaining the status quo. She realized that the only way she could truly control this world was to understand it completely. And the deeper she dug, the more she uncovered about the true nature of her inheritance. Her bloodline wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about a legacy built on manipulation, control, and secrecy. Her family had shaped the very structure of the city without ever being seen. They had been the puppet masters, and the world had never known it. The power she had inherited was not a gift, it was a responsibility that demanded sacrifice. Grace had remained by her side, a quiet strength in a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. The two of them often sat together, discussing what was coming next. They were learning quickly that their enemies were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, operating behind the scenes. And Ethan's warning about her past still echoed in Emily's mind, a constant reminder that her bloodline wasn't something she could escape. It was part of her, part of who she was now, for better or for worse. One night, after a long day of tense meetings and navigating the web of alliances she had begun to build, Emily sat alone in her office, reflecting on everything she had learned. She'd gotten good at hiding her emotions, at keeping her cards close to her chest, but tonight felt different. The weight of it all was catching up to her. Was this really what she wanted? To rule over a kingdom of secrets and lies? She had been given a choice, but was she choosing the right path? The door creaked open, and she looked up to see Michael standing there. His face was unreadable, his posture tense. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. Emily straightened, bracing herself for whatever was coming. "What is it?" Michael stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His eyes were serious. "You're not the only one who's been watching, Emily. I've been doing some digging of my own. About Ethan. About everything." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She knew Michael was a man of action, a strategist. He didn't waste time, and he didn't make idle threats. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the undercurrent of panic rising. Michael hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Ethan's not just trying to take control of the empire. He's been working with someone else. Someone on the inside. There's a faction within your family's legacy, hidden, deep in the shadows, that wants you gone. They want to put someone else in your place." Emily's blood ran cold. Someone else, for all her efforts, for all her newfound power, there were still forces working against her from within. The truth hit her like a physical blow. "Who?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. Michael met her gaze, his expression grave. "It's your uncle. He's the one pulling the strings. He's been behind Ethan the whole time. And now, he's preparing to make his move." Emily felt her world tilt. Her uncle, a name that had always been whispered about in family circles, a man who had disappeared from the public eye years ago, he was the one who wanted to take everything from her. It all made sense now. The power plays, the manipulation, the games Ethan had played. He hadn't been the mastermind. He'd been a pawn in someone else's game. "You're telling me I've been fighting the wrong enemy?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible, as if she were still processing the enormity of it all. Michael nodded. "Yes. Ethan's just a distraction. Your uncle's been building his influence quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, that moment's coming." Emily's mind raced, piecing together the scattered information. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. She had to act, and fast. But how could she fight against someone she couldn't even see? "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice now firm, resolute. Michael stepped closer, his expression softening just slightly. "We fight back. We take control of the narrative. We don't let them write the story for us." You have the power. You have the network. It's time to expose them, Emily. Time to show the world who really pulls the strings. For a moment, there was silence between them. Emily's heart was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of clarity. This was her fight now, not just for survival, but for the future. She had the power to change things, to stop the people who had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. She could expose the corruption, the lies. She could take back control of her life. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and strategizing. Emily brought together the allies she had carefully cultivated, people who had once been part of the system but now stood with her. Together, they began to dismantle the layers of secrecy that had protected her uncle's faction for so long. Emily had always been good at reading people, at knowing which levers to pull, which promises to make. And now, she used that skill to her advantage. It wasn't long before the walls started to crack. Michael had been right, her uncle was powerful, but his influence wasn't untouchable. Emily's plan was simple: expose him to the public, force him into the light. She gathered evidence, connected the dots, and with the help of her allies, she turned the tide in her favor. The truth came out slowly at first, but as it gained momentum, it was unstoppable. The day her uncle's empire began to crumble, Emily watched from her office window as the sun dipped low on the horizon. The city stretched before her, full of opportunity, full of danger. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. She had won. It wasn't a perfect victory. She knew the battle wasn't over, and there would be other enemies, other challenges. But she had learned one important lesson: control wasn't about power over others, it was about control over herself, over her choices, over her future. As Emily looked out over the city, she knew she had made the right decision. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, asterisk on her term star. And no one, not even the ghosts of her past, could take that away.